Welcome back and happy Mother's Day to you. This is, of course, the second Sunday of May, traditionally Mother's Day. I say happy Mother's Day because I'm assuming that all of you have either been a mother, had a mother, or known a mother. And so some of you may fit into all three of those categories. Most of you should fit into at least one of them. So happy Mother's Day. We are continuing in this series looking at the resurrection words of Jesus. As I've said before, most of the time Easter rolls around, we look at one of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, and then we go on from there. But Jesus spent 40 days making appearances to the disciples, and at each one of those appearances, he taught them more. So that's why I'm calling this his resurrection words. There were still things they needed to know, things they needed to understand. And so we are continuing in Luke chapter 24. We'll be in this chapter this week as we were 2 weeks ago, and then next week as well. We missed last week due to illness on my part, but I'm back and feeling very good, and it was just a short-term thing. Beginning with verse 36, while they were still talking about this, that is, the appearance that Jesus made to the two who were on the road to Emmaus, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do you doubt? Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, all these descriptive terms about the way they were reacting at this time. Joy and amazement. He asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now, all of that tells us something about Jesus' resurrected form. He had flesh and bones. He could eat food. He could be touched. There were things about his appearance that were a proof that he had resurrected, like his hands and feet, where he would have had the marks of crucifixion. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." 3 sections of the Old Testament, 3 ways of dividing the Old Testament: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written: the Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Remember, in the first session of this series, we looked at what he says in the first chapter of Acts, when he said to them, wait here. But this time he said, everything written about me must be fulfilled. And I love that terminology. He specifically mentions the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And just very quickly to look at some of the things written about him. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we find what scholars have called the proto-evangelium, which means the first mention of the good news. Proto, Greek for first, evangelium, which is good news. He will crush your head, you will strike his heel. At this point, God is speaking to Satan the serpent. Satan, the serpent's head's going to be crushed, even though the serpent will strike his heel. And most scholars look at that as the first mention of what will eventually happen with Jesus. That yes, Satan will strike his heel. Jesus will be crucified, but Jesus will crush his head. Which is worse? But that's in the law of Moses, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. In the prophets, many, many references to prophets. In fact, if you read through the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew is continually showing something Jesus said, something Jesus did, something that happened to Jesus, and then relating it back to a prophetic message found in the Old Testament. But in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Now, at the time that this was written, the old covenant was in force, the covenant that God made with Abraham, the covenant God made with Moses. But God says, I'm going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. It would not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them out by the hand and led them out of Egypt. That's the covenant made with Moses. Because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer will a person teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. So what is it about this new covenant? It's the kind of covenant that you're not born into. It's the kind of covenant that you're reborn into. So everyone who's part of the covenant already knows the Lord. Whereas in the old covenant, parents had to teach their children in order for them to become part of the covenant. Often there were Jewish people who really didn't know much about the Lord because they didn't take the time to know. And so in this new covenant, the prophet Jeremiah, we don't know how much he understood, but was pointing to the fact that when you and I come into a covenant relationship with the Lord, it's because we already know the Lord. So that's part of the new covenant. That's part of what Jesus brought, is this new covenant. And then just one mention in Psalm 118, verse 22. It's a psalm that was quoted by Jesus. It's a psalm that's mentioned by Peter in his first epistle. The stone the builders rejected became the cornerstone. Some translations say the capstone. The stone that was rejected. There's an old rabbinic story that's supposed to be about the building of Solomon's temple. And there are several different versions of this rabbinic story. One is that they were looking around for the cornerstone. Now, a cornerstone was essential in that kind of construction because the whole rest of the building was built from the perspective of the cornerstone. And yet the idea was that the stone, when it was first quarried, and it was thought that these stones were all quarried some distance away, was set aside and not brought to the construction site. So when they were looking for the cornerstone, they couldn't find it because it had been set aside back at the quarry. The other version of it is that it's not the cornerstone, but the capstone. The capstone was the last stone laid into an arch. It's the stone that would be right in the middle of the top of the arch. That's the capstone. And so the rabbinic story goes that they saw this stone. It seemed odd. It was an odd shape, so they threw it aside. But then when they were completing the construction of the temple and they were completing the arch through which people would walk to go into the temple, they were missing the capstone. And they finally realized, oh, what's that stone that we threw away? So they went and found the stone they threw away, brought it to the site, and completed the construction. So the stone that the builders rejected became the capstone, became the cornerstone, became the important stone upon which everything else was constructed. With Jesus being that cornerstone, with Jesus being that capstone. Just one of many references to Jesus in Psalms. If you read through the book of Hebrews, you'll find over and over the author of Hebrews connected Jesus to various statements found throughout the 150 Psalms. Everything must be fulfilled, Jesus said to them. And in verse 45, then, he opened their minds and he explained these things to them. You might remember earlier in the chapter when he was speaking with the two on the road to Emmaus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained what was written about the Messiah. Simple synopsis that Jesus left them with that day. The Messiah, meaning himself, meaning Jesus, had to suffer, rise again, and that they would then, as witnesses of his resurrection, preach repentance and the forgiveness of sins. And they would proclaim that beginning in Jerusalem, but that they would proclaim it to all the nations. You see, as far as Jesus is concerned, no nation, no race, no ethnicity of people are to be left out when it comes to hearing about the good news of Jesus. Those are just some of Jesus' resurrection words, and I hope you take them to heart. Think them over. Read through this passage again. What does it mean to you, to your life? How are you a witness of these important things? And we're talking about things that happen within the realm of the temporal, but they are eternal truths for you and I to share, so that all might come to a place of understanding, of understanding, of understanding. Let Jesus open your minds, and you will understand. Who are the beloved? Go and be the beloved.